gets thrown around a lot in the strength and conditioning or performance world is evidence-based practice or an evidence-based approach. So I want to talk about what an evidence-based approach to MMA training is and how we can take a more evidence-based approach so that we can optimize the training for our fighters. So what most people think an evidence-based approach is using scientific evidence to guide our practices. That's what everybody thinks, that if I'm not using a research study to guide what I'm supposed to be doing in training, then it's not evidence-based. And that's not actually the case. There's really three components to evidence-based approach. So we've got our best research evidence, but we've also got the opinions of domain experts, the people who've been in the field doing this stuff, coaching these athletes for a long time. And then we've got the athlete values, how the athletes actually feel and what they feel helps them improve their performance. When we're taking an evidence-based approach, if we really want to make the best approach, then we want to be right in here, where we're taking into account all three categories, because all three have some very, very big positives, but also have some limitations. The problem is that currently in MMA, a lot of people are just trying to stay into their own little zone. So you've got the athletes who say, I know what makes me better, I know what's going to improve my performance. But there's limitations to that, which we'll get into. Then you've got the performance coaches and the researchers who are saying, here's all the scientific evidence on improving power output in sports or improving performance in the cage. So if it's not based on this research, then these guys don't know what they're talking about. And then you've got the skills coaches, the MMA coaches who are saying, I've been training fighters for 30 years, these guys don't know what they're talking about, I know everything. So it's a whole bunch of egos just battling against each other. And what happens is, everybody lives out here in the edges of those circles. But if we really want to improve performance for the people who matter, the fighter, then we need to get in here and we need to start working together so that we can optimize performance and take advantage of all these things. So number one, let's talk about best research evidence. This is great because research evidence helps us to understand what's happening with most people most of the time. And the biggest thing with research evidence is we eliminate all the other variables. So because we can control variables, we can actually see what's causing that adaptation. So it's great because when I can start to narrow things down, I can say that this specific exercise, drill, time period, whatever it is that we're testing, improved punching power. And we start to eliminate all these other variables, so we're not guessing anymore. But then we see that happens over over a huge population, and we can start to say that, hey, every time people do this, this improves punching power. So I'll give you an example, something like caffeine or creatine. These are such heavily researched and studied supplements that we see that across massive spectrums of people, they lead to improvements in power and body composition or energy and mental acuity if we're talking about caffeine. So that's what research evidence is really, really helpful to do. And it helps us to create the principles that drive what we do in practice so that we're not just guessing and randomizing things. The problem with research evidence is it's very limited because, number one, it takes a long time for research to come out. Somebody has to get together and say, we should test this thing. So in order to do that, it's going to take a coach who says, hey, I've been doing this and it's improving power in a lot of my boxers and improving their punching power. So then researchers say, we should study that thing. We should start to control some variables. But the first study they do maybe has 20 subjects, and so you're limited by those specific people at that specific time with that specific setup. So once you've started to create 50 of these studies, then we can start to look for trends in the research, and that's going to really help us to guide what we're doing. But if we only have a handful of studies here and there, then it can be very limited. And again, it takes a long time for this stuff to come out. So if you're a coach and you're waiting for somebody to come out with a research study to say you should do this thing, you're at least going to be 3 to 5 years behind other coaches who've already been doing this stuff. And then when it comes to MMA, the sport is so new. There's not a lot of money behind it yet, so there's not a lot of research being done. All this stuff is just happening now. So we don't have decades of research to look back on and be able to best guide our training practices. There is research out there, so that doesn't mean there's an excuse to just say, I'm not going to look at any research because there's not a lot, because there's plenty of research out there, but there's just not a massive pool of it like we have in some other sports. Then we've got domain experts. These are the guys who've been doing this for a long time. They've probably fought professionally themselves. They've probably trained hundreds of fighters. These guys have so much knowledge and through experience that we cannot just excuse them because they don't know the research evidence. Their experience can really help us to shape what works for a lot of different fighters. They've done a lot more research than these researchers, especially in the realm of MMA, because it's so new. So these guys have been doing this stuff in the trenches for such a long time that they have such valuable opinions, and we can learn a lot from these guys. Now the problem here, there's two major problems. One, confirmation bias. When you come up and you do something like, let's say I'm a Muay Thai guy, and I had a lot of success in my career doing a certain type of training. I developed this confirmation bias where I assume that that type of training is the best training for fighters. And then I start to train my own couple Muay Thai fighters that way, and they have some success, and then all of a sudden I think that, okay, I have to do X, Y, and Z, and that's the best way to train fighters. That's called confirmation bias because I'm just feeding this bias, and of course, my people are going to start to have some success, and then I excuse the people who don't have success and say they're too mentally weak, they don't fit this program, they weren't trying hard enough. So I just start to search out for things that are feeding my own bias. And those biases develop over a long period of time, mixed with the ego that is just ever so present in most sports, but a lot in MMA. And it leaves the people just sitting back and holding on to their own biases rather than being objective and saying, is this really the best way? And am I always open to the best way and willing to change if something came in that maybe challenged the way that I do things. And then the other big one here is you're not controlling the variables. So it's really hard for me to say as a coach that this is the best way to improve punching power in a boxer if I don't control all the other variables. But just because I saw punching power improve in 3 of my boxers, it doesn't really say that that one thing is what caused it, because we're not controlling their diet, their sleep, their training regimens, all the other stuff that can possibly go into that. We're not controlling those variables. So it doesn't really allow us to single out some of the best training protocols and develop those principles. But not to be excused, because they have so much experience that there's massive, massive values people can add. And then athlete values. This is really important for 2 major reasons. One, when athletes believe they've received a beneficial treatment or they've received something that's going to improve their performance, it's much more likely to actually improve their performance. A lot of this research is seen more in like recovery or even in supplements and things like that. An athlete believes that they're receiving a beneficial treatment and all of a sudden they feel better the next day. So it's more subjective in that sense, but believing in what you're doing and having full faith in what you're doing will actually help to improve performance. So it's really important that athletes are fully bought in to whatever protocol that they're doing. Another one here is athletes know their body really, really well. And a lot of them are very in tune with their body, and they know what works for them and what doesn't work for them and how they feel. So as a coach, if we can help them to sort through some of those feelings and start to make logical sense with that stuff, then it will help us a lot to kind of get a very clear picture on what helps some of these athletes, because there's so much individualization in physiology that we just can't say that because science and research said that this works. Well, let's use creatine as an example. Just because science says that creatine works for most people to improve strength, but this guy says that it actually gives him, he doesn't sleep well when he's on creatine. Who am I to say that that's wrong? Just because the science says it, he knows his body, he's tried these things out. So we have to listen to what our athletes think, what our athletes say, and what they think. Because it's really, really important, and that nobody knows themselves better than them, and that's how we can individualize all of these things for each individual athlete. Again, some big limitations here. Athletes are very easily influenced. So they find a coach and they really like that coach, and they don't necessarily know the research behind things and what's best, so they just believe in these coaches. And there's a lot of this going on in the MMA world right now. There's a lot of real phony coaches out there who hide behind their motivation and their rah-rah, come on, let's go. And fighters connect with that, and they believe these coaches are phenomenal performance coaches, when in reality, these guys are actually doing them more harm than good. So an athlete can get in his own way a lot of times because of what they like to do. So they connect with somebody who gives them what they like to do, and they like to do stuff. So when they start doing things that look like what they think training should be, all of a sudden that becomes what they think they need. So a lot of times as a performance coach, you need to give an athlete a little bit of what they think they need so you can start really giving them what they actually need. So that's one of the big things. And then the other side of that is also athletes have confirmation bias and they don't control the variables either. So because they say, well, last time I did that type of training, I gained a lot of muscle. It's like, it wasn't the training probably that you gained a lot of muscle, but perhaps it was X, Y, and Z that you were doing and the diet that you were eating and all these other things, because diet is what influences weight gain and weight loss, not your type of training. But he believes that it's the type of training is why he gained muscle and had nothing to do with his diet. So that's where there can be some very big limitations, and we need to be able to start to break down some of those borders and educate these athletes on some of the principles. So again, we can't just excuse the athlete's values as I know what's up, I read all the research, you should listen to me, and we rule with an iron fist, because that's ignorant and there's a lot I can learn from the athlete. Definitely can't excuse domain experts, because people who've been in the trenches doing this stuff for a long time have tons of experience and have a ton of knowledge that they can give to us. And then we certainly need to look back and use the best research evidence. There is research out there, and this should help guide our underlying principles of what we do. Then we can start to add variability and we can start to innovate based on those principles. Otherwise, innovation just becomes this searching for kind of whatever the next fad is and just doing stuff versus actually creating new things that might lead to better adaptations and overall better fighters. So all three of these things are massively important if we want to have the best chance of improving performance for an MMA athlete. Then we need to take into account all three components of an evidence-based approach. Not just sit back on any one of these three, because we're going to be limited in some of those limitations I just discussed. So that's what an evidence-based approach is. I hope that this helps you guys, whether you're a fighter, a skill coach, or a performance coach. All three of you people need to be working together as much as possible so that we can create the best training plans to optimize performance for the fighters that transfers into the cage for the long term.